When Americans spend time in Australia, they often come away with lessons they were never formally taught. No one sits them down to explain the culture, and no one gives instructions on how to live. Instead, daily life itself becomes the teacher. Through small routines, casual interactions, and the way people move through their day, Australia quietly communicates values that Americans absorb over time, often without realizing when the shift begins. It's not about grand philosophical revelations or dramatic cultural clashes. It's quieter than that, more subtle. The lessons arrive in how a barista makes conversation while preparing coffee, in how strangers navigate shared spaces, in how colleagues talk about their weekends with genuine interest rather than performative small talk. Americans describe it as learning through osmosis, where the environment itself models a different way of being without demanding change. You're not told to slow down. You just notice that rushing feels out of place. You're not lectured about balance. You simply observe that most people seem to have found it. And over time, these observations settle into your own rhythms, reshaping assumptions about how life should feel and what a good day looks like. One of the first lessons comes from pace. Australians don't seem obsessed with squeezing the maximum output from every minute. People still work, plan, and commit, but daily life doesn't feel like a constant race against time. For Americans used to measuring progress through urgency, this slower rhythm gently teaches that productivity doesn't always need pressure to exist alongside it. Morning commutes happen without the aggressive desperation that characterizes rush hour in major American cities. People walk at a human pace rather than power walking through every errand. Lunch breaks are actually taken, not eaten hunched over a keyboard while answering emails. Even the way people queue teaches something. There's patience without fidgeting, waiting without visible frustration, and acceptance that some things simply take the time they take. Americans often describe feeling almost guilty at first for not being in constant motion, as if slowing down means laziness or lack of ambition. But over time, that guilt fades. They begin to notice that Australians accomplish plenty without performing stress, that deadlines are met without drama, that life moves forward steadily without requiring everyone to sprint. The lesson becomes clear without words. Urgency and importance aren't the same thing, and rest isn't the opposite of achievement. Another lesson appears in conversation. Interactions tend to feel relaxed and balanced, without an obvious need to assert status, background, or importance. Americans often notice that people listen fully before responding, and that conversations don't feel like competitions to be the most impressive or the most efficient. Over time, this quietly teaches a different way of connecting, one where presence matters more than performance. There's less interrupting, less positioning, less maneuvering to steer every exchange toward personal accomplishments. People ask questions and actually wait for answers. Silence between thoughts isn't awkward. It's just part of the rhythm. Stories are told for their own sake, not as vehicles for self-promotion. Humor tends toward self-deprecation rather than elevation at others' expense. Even professional networking feels less transactional, less about extracting value from every interaction. Americans describe initially struggling with this, unsure how to engage without familiar scripts. But gradually they learn that maybe no script is needed. Conversations become less exhausting when you're not constantly calculating. Connection becomes possible when you're not performing. And this reshapes how Americans think about relationships entirely. Public spaces reinforce these lessons without saying a word. Parks, cafes, sidewalks, and beaches are used as places to linger rather than rush through. People sit without purpose, walk without urgency, and occupy space without apology. For Americans, this environment subtly teaches that rest doesn't need to be earned, and that simply existing in a space is reason enough to be there. There's no pressure to constantly consume or justify your presence. A park bench is for sitting, not just for those who finished their workout. A cafe table is for lingering over one coffee, not a productivity station requiring multiple purchases. The beach at midday on a Wednesday isn't just for tourists or the unemployed, it's for anyone. Public transport feels shared rather than combative. Sidewalks accommodate different paces without aggression. Even city centers have pockets of calm where people pause without being moved along. Americans raised where public space often feels hostile find this quietly revolutionary. They learn cities can be designed for people, not just commerce. They absorb the lesson that rest is a right, not a reward. And they discover that when everyone has permission to simply exist, public life becomes more humane. Taken together, these small observations quietly reshape how Americans experience daily life. The lessons aren't dramatic or immediate, but they accumulate over time. Each small adjustment, a slightly slower pace here, a more genuine conversation there, a moment of rest without guilt, builds into something larger. Americans begin noticing they're less tense in their bodies, less defensive in their interactions, less anxious about time itself. They stop checking phones compulsively. They start actually tasting their food. They find themselves accepting invitations they might have declined back home, not because schedules opened up, but because their relationship with time has shifted. The cultural environment has taught them, gently and without force, that life can be lived differently. Not better or worse necessarily, but differently, with more breath, more presence, more room for the unscheduled and unoptimized. And this lesson, once absorbed, becomes difficult to unlearn. It changes what feels normal, what feels necessary, what feels worth protecting. If you enjoy exploring how everyday routines teach us something deeper about the places we live, subscribing helps you stay connected as we uncover these subtle differences and what they reveal. As time passes, Americans also begin to notice how Australians relate to time itself. Schedules exist, plans are made, and commitments are respected, but there's less anxiety attached to every minute. This teaches that time can be structured without being suffocating, and that flexibility doesn't automatically mean lack of care or responsibility. Running 5 minutes late doesn't trigger panic or elaborate apologies. A meeting that ends early is a gift, not inefficiency. Plans can shift without drama when life requires it. There's structure, but it breathes. It bends without breaking. Americans accustomed to calendar Tetris find this initially unsettling, then liberating. They learn that being on time is valued, but being human is valued more. That efficiency matters, but so does adaptability. That commitment is important, but so is recognizing when circumstances change. This flexible relationship with time extends into thinking about futures too. Career paths aren't always linear. Gap years aren't falling behind. Taking time off isn't career suicide. Life is long, and there's less pressure to have everything figured out by a certain age. This patient approach teaches Americans that urgency and importance aren't synonyms, and that sometimes the best use of time is letting it unfold. Daily routines reinforce this lesson in quiet ways. Commuting doesn't feel like a daily battle, meeting friends doesn't feel rushed, and errands don't carry the same sense of urgency. Without consciously trying, Americans often find themselves adjusting their own expectations, learning to move through their day with a little more patience and less self-imposed pressure. The grocery store trip becomes just that, not a timed mission to optimize. Walking to the train station is walking, not a race. Waiting for a table is an opportunity to chat, not an inconvenience. These small shifts accumulate into a larger transformation in how life feels. Americans describe it as a gradual softening, a letting go of tension they didn't realize they were holding. They stop treating every task as urgent. They stop measuring worth by productivity. They stop feeling guilty for enjoying moments that serve no purpose beyond enjoyment. The lesson isn't about laziness. Australians still accomplish things, meet deadlines, pursue goals, but the relationship to those pursuits feels different, less desperate, less all-consuming, more sustainable. And Americans absorb it almost unconsciously. Their bodies relax, their minds quiet. They discover life can move forward effectively without constant stress as fuel. Americans also notice how life doesn't revolve around proving success. There's less pressure to constantly explain who you are or what you do, and that freedom, subtle but powerful, makes everyday life feel lighter and more human. In the States, what do you do? Often comes within the first 3 minutes of meeting someone, and your answer determines how the conversation unfolds, how much respect you receive, whether people lean in or drift away. In Australia, that question arrives later, if at all, and it's asked with genuine curiosity rather than social sorting. People introduce themselves by their interests, their neighborhood, what they did last weekend. Identity isn't collapsed into occupation. You'll meet someone at a party who turns out to be a surgeon, but they spent 20 minutes talking about their terrible golf game first. The tradie working on your house might have a philosophy degree, and no one treats that as failure. There's less performance, less resume recitation, less anxiety about being impressive enough to deserve basic human warmth. Americans describe it as exhausting to realize how much energy they'd been spending on self-justification and how relieving it is to just exist without that constant audition. Friendships form differently here, slower maybe, but built on who people actually are. That's what daily life in Australia teaches Americans without ever needing to explain itself. It shows that calm, balance, and respect can exist inside ordinary moments, woven into routines people barely think about. The lessons aren't delivered through lectures or guidebooks. They're absorbed through lived experience, through noticing how days feel different, how interactions carry less tension, how time expands when you're not constantly fighting it. Americans leave carrying these lessons, sometimes consciously, often not. They might not articulate exactly what changed, but they feel it. They notice themselves pausing before rushing. They catch themselves actually listening instead of waiting to speak. They find moments of rest without guilt. Some attempt to recreate these patterns back home, with mixed success. Cultural environment matters, and individual changes can only go so far against systemic pressure. But the awareness remains. The knowledge that life can feel different, that another way exists, that the urgency and anxiety they'd normalized isn't inevitable. And that knowledge itself is valuable. It becomes a reference point, a reminder of what's possible when culture supports presence over performance. If this perspective resonated, share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more stories exploring how everyday life quietly shapes how we see the world.